Excellent. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all safe and well. My name is Tanvir Jaikishen, and as Anand explained, I am a China watcher and have a passionate interest in geopolitics and military history. And he reached out to me a few days ago and asked me to put together this little talk so we can discuss the India-China Eastern Ladakh standoff and sort of contextualize it to the wider geopolitical great game that China is playing out in the Himalayas as well as in its own neighborhood and around the world. Now, let me dive in and say that, and let me dive in and start by saying that any magic trick, ladies and gentlemen, has three acts to it. The first act is the pledge. Now, in the pledge, what the magician does is he shows you something ordinary, like an object, and asks you to inspect it. The next act is the turn. In this act, what the magician does is he takes this object and disappears it or slices it in half, does something absolutely extraordinary with it. Now, it's not just important to disappear an object or saw it in half. It's important that you put it back together again, make it whole, bring it back. And that brings us to the third act, the prestige. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that this is beyond the geopolitical great game that we are seeing in the high Himalayas. This is a Chinese magic act. And over the course of the next hour, I would like you to pour yourselves a drink. I would like you to sit back, relax, and get on a journey with me where we will unravel what these Chinese machinations are and what India can do to prevent them. Now, please divert your attention to the map in front of you. Let's summarize the events so far very briefly. In the first week of May, the elements of the 362nd and the 363rd Chinese Border Regiment, reinforced with the 6th Mechanized Infantry Division in Xinjiang, occupied the ridge lines of the Galwan Valley and the hot springs and Demchok and the Gogra area at patrol points 14, 15, and 17. These elements also occupied the fingers of the Pangong Tso Lake, but we will come to that a little later. Now, when they occupied the ridge lines, immediately the pundits in the media started speculating as to why this incursion had happened. Obviously, we've had standoffs with China before, whether it was the Depsang Bulge in 2013, whether it's Chumar in 2014, the Doklam standoff in 2017, but there was something unique, something unexpected about the sheer scale of this standoff. And the pundits in the media said, okay, there are many reasons why this could have taken place. A, the Galwan Valley is extremely strategic. It acts as a protective buffer to our troops in the Siachen Glacier. B, perhaps China is unnerved by the rapid infrastructure development in the Galwan Valley and also the broader line of actual control, given the fact that India is developing around 70 border roads along the Chinese border, from Ladakh all the way up to Arunachal Pradesh. Some pundits argue that China simply wants more land or more strategic buffer between the Aksai Chin and Ladakh. And there are pundits who believe that this was a direct consequence of the abrogation of Article 370. In which both Amit Shah said that we will have full physical jurisdiction of Aksai Chin one day, and even S. Jaishankar said that Pakistan-occupied Kashmir is an integral part of India and we hope to have physical jurisdiction of it one day. So there are many reasons why this sort of standoff has happened as per speculation, but I submit, ladies and gentlemen, that everything that you are seeing today is simple misdirection. Let us go on to the next slide and let us look at the pledge, ladies and gentlemen.
Tanvir, a small request. Could you just maximize the screen, please, on your computer so that...
Yes.
As in get it on the presentation mode so that...
Okay, sure. There we go.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption.
No worries, Al. Right, gentlemen. Let's look at the facts. When the initial media reports came out, what had come out was that over 10,000 Chinese troops had crossed 2 to 3 kilometers across the line of control and pitched tents and pitched sort of created structures in the hot springs and the Galwan River Valley and the Pangong Tso Lake area. Now, this map, which has been taken from the Australian Policy Research Institute, show very clearly that the Chinese buildup has been minimal in the Galwan River Valley and the hot springs area, and it has been very much on the line of control, reinforced with new fortifications behind the line of control, with the notable exception being Pangong Tso, which we will come to in a minute. And the size and scale of this buildup hasn't been maybe 10,000 troops. It's been few hundred troops in tents along the Petrol Point 14, Petrol Point 15, and Petrol Point 17 ridge lines. The strategic objective to overlook the Daulat Beg Oldie Shiok Dabruk Road, because it is a strategically important road linking Leh to Daulat Beg Oldie, giving them the ability to obliterate it or shell it in times of war, preventing the Indian army or the Indian armed forces from moving sort of men and material across this important highway. Now, everybody knows what happened on the 15th and 16th of June. A detachment of Indian soldiers went to oversee the disengagement at Petrol Point 14, found the Chinese tents still remaining, and when they tried to uproot it, a group of 300 Chinese soldiers attacked. Reinforcements were called. Vicious fight ensued with soldiers clubbing each other to death with cudgels, with barbed iron rods. There was serious loss of life on both sides. And then China went to put out a statement claiming sovereignty of the entire Galwan Valley, which was surprising because what both sides agreed on is that in the Galwan region, the Chinese claim line and the line of actual control actually are the same. And as a consequence of that, the entire media narrative or the entire country's obsession has focused on the Galwan Valley because of this clash and China's subsequent claim. I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Galwan Valley, the clash and the claim are irrelevant. And now we look to the next slide, the turn. While these clashes were taking place in the Galwan Valley, and while China made its claim to the Galwan Valley, they have completely altered the status quo in the Pangong Tso Lake. Now let's look at this map for a minute here. You can see in this map that the Pangong Tso Lake on the north ridge is divided into fingers. India claims the LAC ends at finger 8. China claims that its claim line is at finger 2. So there is a huge disparity in terms of perceptions between finger 2 and finger 8. And what usually happens is that India has a very strong presence at finger 4, and it routinely patrols between finger 4 and finger 8. And the Chinese soldiers routinely patrol between finger 8 and finger 2. And often during these patrols, there are some clashes. But these clashes have by and large been non-violent. They've been maybe pushing and shoving. They haven't been really intense clashes. It's just par for course. While China was making these outlandish claims of sovereignty in the Galwan Valley, and while it started this horrific bloodbath, they have constructed over 53 structures. And these are not temporary structures, ladies and gentlemen. These are permanent structures. These are fortifications. These are concrete bunkers. These are a significant buildup and a significant escalation. And why this is important is because between India and China, there have been 4 border agreements, one signed in 1993, the other in 96, one in 2005 and 2013. And these border agreements very clearly state that in areas that are considered disputed, that is the area, say, between finger 2 and finger 8, there will be no construction of any kind of settlement, whether temporary and permanent. So obviously what China has done is it's altered the status quo on the ground. It has violated all of these border agreements, and it has done so while the entire nation's attention has been on the incident at the Galwan Valley. That having said, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the Pangong Tso is irrelevant. Let us move to the third slide, or the prestige. Now, in the next few days, I wager you're going to start hearing about an area called the Depsang Bulge or the Depsang Plains. Now, bear in mind, there was a face-off between India and China in the Depsang Bulge in 2013. And both sides sort of withdrew after intense negotiation and talks, maybe in after around 6 weeks of intense negotiation and talks. And there are unconfirmed reports that China has moved heavy material bulldozers and significant amount of soldiers onto the line of control, or maybe a little beyond the line of control in the Depsang Bulge. Why is this? Again, ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that the Depsang Bulge is irrelevant. The ultimate prize or the ultimate geostrategic goal is the Daulat Beg Oldie. And by occupying these positions along the DBO Shayok Dabrok Leh road, China aims to cut off this vitally important road, preventing the Indian armed forces from being able to transport men and material to the LAC, and more importantly, to the Daulat Beg Oldie. Now, what is significant about Daulat Beg Oldie is that it is an airstrip, but more than an airstrip, ladies and gentlemen, it is an airstrip at a height that looks over the Karakoram highway connecting China and Pakistan. Now, why that is important is that China has over $60 billion worth of infrastructure projects in the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor, and they will do anything to protect these projects. And obviously, they feel that as long as India has a military presence at the Daulat Beg Oldie, and as long as India has the heights over the Daulat Beg Oldie, we have the ability to, what do you say, shell it, destroy it, obliterate the Karakoram highway in terms, if hostilities break out, maybe even occupy if hostilities break out, severing a vital link between China and Pakistan. Now, also as an added loss, if the Daulat Beg Oldie was taken by the Chinese, it would cut off the Siachen Glacier. It would put enormous pressure on our ability to supply our troops in the Siachen Glacier and would make our position in the Siachen Glacier possibly untenable. Interesting fun fact about the Daulat Beg Oldie. As I said earlier, this was just a simple airstrip. It was reactivated in the UPA regime when the Indian Air Force, let me just get a sip of coffee. When the Indian Air Force flew an Antonov 32 transport aircraft in dead secrecy to reactivate this advanced landing ground, but they did it without informing the government. And this news came out recently where the then air chief said, look, we did this without informing the government. We felt it was an operational necessity. And then we informed the government that we did it. So this is why I believe the Daulat Beg Oldie is a geostrategic flashpoint. I believe that China is trying to cut off access to the Daulat Beg Oldie and eventually swallow it up. And I believe that this is the reason that they have caused all of this misdirection, get us to focus on other aspects of the buildup, but take our eye off the ball on Daulat Beg Oldie. Again, I am not a military man. I do not have access to the advanced satellite imagery that the Indian political establishment and military establishment does. This is my speculation based on logic and common sense. I could be wrong. And if there are those who have served in this particular theater of war or who have some experience who are willing to contradict me, you may do so after this call in the question and answer session. Now, we now move on to the next part. Can they do it? Do they have the means to actually wrest territory from us through war? Because there's this huge ghost of 1962 that looms over our head. So let's look at the Chinese and Indian force dispositions across the line of actual control. Now, what the Chinese did in 2016 is that they combined their military districts into 5 theater commands, with the Western Theater Command being responsible for conflict with India. Now, the Western Theater Command houses the 76th and the 77th Army groups at Chongqing and Baizhou, respectively, and have around 120,000 men-at-arms, as well as the 2 military districts within the Western Theater Command is the Tibet military district and the Xinjiang military district. Now, the Tibet military district has about 40,000 Chinese troops put in place basically to handle any uprisings. And likewise, the Xinjiang military district has about 70,000 military troops in place to handle any possible uprisings in that restive region with the Uyghurs. So you're looking at a total sort of strength of about 230,000 men. Now, India, let's look at the Indian army. The Indian army has 3 commands responsible for China. One is the Northern Command for Jammu and Kashmir and Leh Ladakh. You then have the Central Command and you have the Eastern Command. Now, together, these 3 commands have around 225,000 troops. So you have equal number of troops in terms of troop disposition. You have T-72 tank regiments. You have a regiment of BrahMos missiles in Tawang. You've got, and obviously over the last few days, these, troops would have been augmented with more tanks, with more missiles, with more artillery. So it's unclear what kind of current troop disposition and equipment disposition exists now, but in peacetime, this is by and large these sort of pieces on the chessboard. So what we can see very clearly is that there is a near parity in terms of manpower between the 2 sides. And bear in mind that India is a battle-hardened army. We have fought wars with Pakistan. We fight a low-level insurgency or a high-level insurgency in Jammu and Kashmir. We are fighting an insurgency in the Northeast. We undertake UN peacekeeping missions. We are a very battle-hardened army. We are acclimatized. We have probably one of the best mountaineering armies in the world. So there is a certain edge in terms of the caliber and quality of Indian soldiers. Now let's look at the Air Force. Now, when we talk about the Air Force, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to keep in mind this very important military term, a very important technical term, MTOW, maximum takeoff weight. And this is where the Indian Air Force enjoys a significant edge over its Chinese counterparts. See, most of China's air bases are in the high altitudes of Tibet. And even if you have the most advanced jets, the Chengdu J-20, the J-10s, these jets, by virtue of taking off from a high altitude, cannot carry the full amount of fuel load, and it cannot carry the full armaments that is usually designed to carry. So what does that mean? It means that China would require 2 to 3 times more number of jets to maintain a continuous air presence, to fly regular air sorties, and at the same time it requires air-to-air refueling tankers, which it currently lacks. So in that sense, there is a clear disadvantage on the Chinese side, as well as also the fact that the PLAAF haven't really fought combat, sorties, or haven't really been in an air war with an adversary in decades. Now you compare that to the Indian Air Force. The Indian Air Force has around 200, in regular peacetime, has around 270 aircraft along the line of actual control. These include frontline fourth generation Sukhoi 30s. These include the upgraded MiG-29s. These include Jaguar ground bombers. These include, and the first group of Rafale fighters are indeed going to be based in this particular theater of operations. If required, the Indian Air Force can always call in the MiG-29Ks from the Navy. The Indian Air Force has AWACS, as well as can also requisition the P-8I Poseidon sort of anti-submarine long-range fighters if required. And so obviously the Indian Air Force is a huge and significant sort of edge in this region. Not, I would say, not a parity, but an edge, and are also well placed to sort of take on the Chinese Air Force. What we've also been reading is that the Indian Air Force has deployed Apache combat helicopters. There's also been movement of light combat Rudra helicopters into the area, which means that the Indian Army actually has these close support units, combat units, air units in place to support it should ground-based infantry divisions actually need to go into combat. So from a force disposition standpoint, there is actually a lot of sort of parity in force structures, more parity than we would give credit usually, or more parity than our media would give credit. So the question is, can they acquire these lands or these territories by fight? I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that they are not interested in fighting. They are not interested in firing a shot, simply because they believe in achieving their territorial goals through strategic encirclement, through bullying, through intimidation. And let's look at how they've been doing this in the other parts, in their immediate neighborhood and in other parts of the world, and then sort of summarize. This is a map of the South China Sea. Now, I'll be brief here. The United Nations Conventions of the Laws of the Sea states that for any state, the first 200 nautical miles of ocean from that state's coastline is its exclusive economic zone. So what that means is, if you're a country, for 200 nautical miles from your shoreline, you can look for oil, you can look for natural gas deposits, you can look for minerals, you can do as you please. Now, if you look at the lines in blue, you see very clearly the Chinese, you see very clearly the, you see very clearly the exclusive economic zones of Vietnam, of Malaysia, of Philippines, of Brunei. Now look at this red line, ladies and gentlemen. This is what is called the 9-dash line. Now the 9-dash line is basically China claiming 90% of the South China Sea. Now, why is this? Because the South China Sea is mineral rich, it's resource rich, it is rich in oil and gas deposits, and China as a country is resource hungry and will do anything and everything to push its claims. China has, despite overlapping claims of the Spartlace feature between Malaysia, Brunei, and Philippines, China has fully occupied the Spartlace. They have built up artificial islands. They have reclaimed kilometers of land. They have built deep water ports and deep water harbors to house naval ships and submarines. They have inducted missile systems. They have inducted coastal batteries, and they have made this into a floating fortress. If you recall, a couple of years back, Philippines actually took the Chinese to the International Court of Arbitration over the Spartlace and Scarborough Shoal. The International Court of Arbitration ruled in favor of the Philippines, but the Chinese said, you know what, the hell with you, this is our land. And they do this through brute force. So what you can see here is a very clear militarization of the South China Sea, a very clear grabbing of the South China Sea in clear violation of every international law and every international norm. Now let us turn our attention to what they have been doing in Taiwan. Ladies and gentlemen, China has always wanted to bring Taiwan into its to part of the sort of one China system. Currently, it's one country, two systems policy, where you have China being a communist party, a sort of a communist rule, and Taiwan being a democracy. But they have not hit their sort of designs and ambitions to sort of integrate Taiwan back under the Chinese sort of the People's Republic's umbrella, right? So, and what they've done very impressively over the last 20 years is that they have built up a significant anti-access and area denial capability in the region. Now, what is anti-access and area denial? It is basically creating fast interceptor boats. It is basically building up a very impressive navy, the largest navy in the world with over 300 hulls, and building up a system of coastal batteries, and thousands of ballistic missiles to not only overwhelm Taiwan, but also American assets on American bases, not in Japan and Korea, but in the second island chain, in Guam, in the Marianas. And that is simply because they realize and they understand now that America does not have the military prowess to take them on in the Taiwan Straits. Why that is that over the last 2 decades, what has happened is that America has been fighting a sort of low-lying insurgency, a guerrilla warfare, a war on terror. They haven't really sort of looked to upgrade their military to fight a country with a comparable or maybe a better military strength. And as a result, there have been several Pentagon studies that have showed that, you know, in case of hostilities in the Taiwan Straits, the Chinese would win a decisive victory. Now, America has worked or is working very hard to remedy that. Last year, they walked out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which prohibited them from building ballistic missiles of their own. So America has now moved towards the construction of ballistic missiles. It has moved towards the construction of ground-based ballistic missiles and naval ballistic missiles. However, I do believe that America has lost the military, tactical, and strategic edge in the Taiwan Straits, and it would take them another 5 to 10 years for them to sort of pick up that edge and get some parity with the Chinese sort of naval presence, as well as the ballistic missile and anti-access area denial capabilities in the region. My belief is that should China want to go to war to occupy Taiwan, it would get a bloody nose, it would lose significantly, but by and large, it would be able to achieve its geostrategic objectives. Now, let's briefly touch upon Hong Kong before we move into the most exciting part of the discussion, which is the Indian Ocean region. As I'm sure you recall, in June or July of last year, protests broke out in Hong Kong. This was because the Hong Kong administration tried to push together a sort of extradition bill that would allow criminals in Hong Kong to be extradited to the Chinese mainland and be tried there. There were a huge amount of protests saying that Hong Kong is an autonomous region, it should be there as such. And what had happened was eventually, because of these protests, the extradition bill was tabled, not shelved, tabled. So the protesters said, hey, wait a minute, we don't want it to be tabled, we want it to be shelved, and the protests continued. However, in January of this year, the COVID-19 pandemic broke out, there were lockdowns, and the protests sort of dissipated. You know what? Everybody thought that China would move in tanks, it would move in armored personnel carriers, it would create another Tiananmen Square, it would crack down brutally, but none of that happened. What China did was that when the COVID restrictions were lifted in China, it went into the Hong Kong legislature, dragged out the pro-democracy Hong Kong legislatures kicking and screaming, and very carefully and very sadistically passed a Hong Kong security bill. Now, what the security bill allows is basically criminalizing of certain kinds of dissent, as well as allowing criminals to be extradited to the mainland and tried. So they were able to achieve their geostrategic objectives without firing a shot, without putting a single boot on the ground, and without resolving to any kind of violence or thuggery and earning international ire and condemnation. So what's very clear is a pattern of Chinese aggressiveness, a pattern of Chinese intimidation, a pattern of Chinese bullying, and they have done this, ladies and gentlemen, without firing a shot. I'm sure you're aware of the Sham Saran report of 2013. If you're not, in 2013, a retired, an IAS officer named Sham Saran, or rather, I'm not fully aware of his title, published a report saying that 700 square kilometers of land in Ladakh has been gobbled up by the Chinese through salami slicing. And how they have done it is usually what they would do is they would send in their herders. And then when the herders would graze on this occupied, disputed land, the PLA would follow. And that's how they've been able to sort of capture large swaths of land in the more peaceful areas and the less strategically important areas of Ladakh. Likewise, even in the South China Sea, what they typically do is they would send in their fishing trawlers, and their fishing trawlers would then start fishing in these disputed waters. And then they would send in the People's Liberation Army, Navy, Coast Guard vessels and naval vessels, and they would say, hey, our fishing trawlers are fishing in these waters. These waters have always belonged to us. QED, this entire stretch belongs to us. And this is basically how they have been grabbing through encirclement, through salami slicing, 1 inch at a time, inch by inch by inch, without having to fire a shot or without having to resort to any kind of violence, through sheer information warfare, psychological warfare, and bullying. Now, coming to the last a bit of this discussion before we move into the question and answers, and I think this is by far for me the most exciting part of the discussion, and it's not very much talked about because it's not as exciting or interesting as what's happening in Eastern Ladakh, is the great game being played out in the Indian Ocean region. See, the Chinese have already pretty much occupied the South China Sea, and now they want to sort of encircle India on the high seas, making it difficult for India to actively assert its naval dominance. And what it's done is it's used a combination of its fat checkbook and depth diplomacy to actually create a string of naval bases around India, as a sort of, some as full-fledged naval bases, some as strategic listening posts, to keep track on Indian ships in the region. So let's look at what China is doing in the Indian Ocean region, and then we look at what India's response has been. So as you can see by this map, China has very clearly, created naval listening stations in Chittagong, in Kyapu, Hambantota. Everybody knows the story, but let me summarize for those who don't know, because this is an interesting case study of Chinese depth diplomacy. So what the Chinese did was that they moved into Hambantota. They went to the Sri Lankans and said, hey, we will build you a world-class port. We will charge you an interest rate of 6.8% on the loan, but don't worry, you're going to see 10,000 ships every year, and you will be able to pay that money back in no time. So the Sri Lankans agreed. And when that happened, they ended up, bear with me a second. So when that happened, ladies and gentlemen, and when the Hambantota port opened up, what transpired was that instead of seeing 10,000 ships in the first year, they saw 37 ships in the first year. And as a result, they could not pay back the loan to China. And what they did was instead cede the Hambantota port to China for 99 years. Now, initially, this port was supposed to be a purely commercial port, but Chinese submarines and Chinese naval ships have been spotted. China has converted it into a naval listening station. And this is an interesting aspect of how China operates, because China doesn't really spend out of its own pocket, right? It doesn't have the vast cash reserve. So what it does is it typically borrows from the World Bank. China has borrowed close to $16 billion from the World Bank at interest rates of anywhere between 1% and 3%. And what it does is when it has these BRI projects, it constructs these rails or these ports and charges interest rates of anywhere between 4 and 7%. So you can see that they're already making a sort of healthy profit on the loan that they have taken out, while being absolutely certain that the host country really can't pay back for the infrastructure. And this is something that China has similarly done in the Maldives. They have purchased an island in which they are actually now dredging deep harbors and are building sort of deep water ports and setting up a naval listening station. And most importantly is the port authority, is the port in Gaudar. So, bear with me a second. Now, Gaudar, the Chinese were already constructing Gaudar port in Karachi as a deep water port. But over the last few days and weeks, what we have seen is they have actually started erecting guard structures. They've been erecting perimeter fences. They're erecting military barracks. They're erecting very sophisticated, features. And the speculations is that they are going to convert it into a joint China-Pakistan sort of naval base. So in the event of hostilities between India and Pakistan, should hostilities break out, they will not be able to what do you say, attack the Gaudar port the way the Indian Navy was able to do so in 1971. And what I would like to focus on in specific here is the Chinese port in Djibouti. Now, this is a very interesting case study, and this is the extent of how rapacious China as a country is. Now, Djibouti, ladies and gentlemen, has a GDP of $1.7 billion annually. To put that in context, Mukesh Ambani made 15 billion in the last 8 weeks. All right. Djibouti owes China 80%, that's 80% of its GDP in debt. So what it said was, look, we cannot pay you that kind of money, obviously, but we will let you construct the port. So what they have done is they have set up a Chinese military base, which is, as you can see, just a few kilometers away from America's Camp Lemonnier, where they sort of fly sorties against Al-Shabaab terrorists in Somalia. And what's strategically important about its force, about this particular military base, is that it is at the tip of the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. Now, the Bab al-Mandeb Strait is strategically very, very, very important because most of the oil and crude that transits from the Middle East to Europe and Asia passes through the Bab al-Mandeb. So it gives them a very important sort of sentinel watchtower to monitor traffic through the Bab al-Mandeb and ensure that their energy is, or their energy transport or their energy trade lines are being completely protected. So you can see very clearly a great, well thought out game of strategic encirclement, of using its checkbooks, of pushing countries deep into debt, of taking advantage of that debt, and then sort of leveraging that to create these naval stations to assert domination and hegemony in the region. And I would submit, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a far more serious threat to India's sort of geopolitical interests, simply because these are the trade routes through which India has supplied her energy, her oil. And to lose these trade routes or to be choked in times of war would be catastrophic because we would not have the adequate reserves. So with that in mind, let us look at what India has done in the last few years to counter this Chinese sort of build up in the Indian Ocean region. Now, I apologize for the crudeness of this map. It is the best map I could get given the circumstances. Now, India, the most valuable port that India has at its disposal is the Andaman and Nicobar Naval and Air Force Station. Why that is because the Andaman and Nicobar Islands is posed very geostrategically at the mouth of the Malacca Strait. And the Malacca Strait, if you can see, I'm not able to point my voice, but if you look at the little strip of ocean between where it says Changi, Singapore, that, gentlemen and ladies, is the Malacca Strait. Now, why is the Malacca Strait important? Because as late as 2018, 80% of Chinese oil and Chinese crude and Chinese energy passed through the Straits of Malacca. So obviously the Andaman and Nicobar Islands is a very important geostrategic base. It is the site of India's first and only tri-service command, where you have Army, Navy and Air Force all working cohesively under one command, with its key strategic goal to sort of block off and choke the Straits of Malacca should hostilities increase or between the two countries. What else has India been doing to sort of counter Chinese aggression in the Indian Ocean region? Well, India has been very smartly entering into logistic pacts agreements with friendly nations. And what these logistic pacts say is that, hey, we will use your naval bases to dock, refuel and rearm our ships, and you can use our naval stations to dock, refuel and rearm your ships. So India has signed, logistics agreements or bilateral logistics agreements with the Sabang port in Indonesia. It has signed agreements with the Changi port in Singapore. It is currently building a naval base in the Assumption Islands of Seychelles. It is currently building a naval station in the Aglega of Mauritius. It enjoys reciprocal arrangements with the US and Diego Garcia. It has developed listening posts in Mauritius and Madagascar. And it has also signed logistics agreements with the Duqm port in Oman. And it is in the process of constructing the Chabar port in Iran, where no doubt once the construction is complete, it would be able to sort of base its naval ships there. Very interestingly, in the last couple of weeks, when Modi and the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison had their sort of bilateral virtual summit, They sort of signed a virtual pact to allow Indian naval ships to dock and refuel and rearm in Australian ports, while Australian ships could do the same in Indian ports. So we can now, obviously the map hasn't been updated, but we can certainly add Australia to this list of friendly ports where India can now dock its naval stations, naval ships rather, and then use them as sort of viable ports in case the Chinese have to be counted on the high seas. Um, Now, the entire nature or the whole the title of this discussion, ladies and gentlemen, has been chess pieces on a Waikwi board. What does that mean? India, see, chess was invented in India, and when we think of chess, we think of parity of pieces on the board. We say, okay, my opponent has so many pawns, I will have so many pawns. They have two rooks, I have two rooks. I have two knights, they have two knights. And the whole goal of chess is to get your pieces to the other end of the board and checkmate the king. So when we think of our strategic tactical calculus, we see it in terms of chess. We see it in terms of force parity. We see it in terms of, okay, if I have to get to the other side and checkmate the king, what kind of force structures do I need? What kind of power do I need to project? And how do I do so? The Chinese, however, play a very ancient board game called Waikui, or Waikui, pardon my pronunciation, it could be a little off. Waikui, the English term for Waikui is Go. And how does Go work? So basically, Go works by placing black and white tiles on a board. And the whole objective is to arrange these black and white tiles in such a way so that one player tries to encircle the other player's tiles as much as possible. And the winner of that game is the player who has encircled his opponent's, who's encircled more of his opponent's tiles than he has been encircled by his opponents. So the Chinese think in terms of strategic encirclement. They don't think in terms of direct contact or direct conflict. They think in terms of, okay, how do I leverage my enemy's enemy? How do I take a country in my neighborhood or in my periphery and woo it? How do I turn it to my side? How do I ramp up infrastructure? What do I need to do to make sure that I have a presence and I have this country that is absolutely friendly and inimical to my interests, so that when the time comes, my adversary is surrounded on so many fronts that they just lose the will to fight. They feel, just starting going off the blocks, that fighting is futile, that fighting is unnecessary, it's redundant, it serves no value or purpose. And that, in a nutshell, is the Chinese great game. And obviously, ladies and gentlemen, this great game is going to continue. It's going to accelerate. And I'll tell you why. And with this, I'm going to end and open the floor for questions. And that's because of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping, ladies and gentlemen, is an authoritarian leader. He does not see himself as as any ordinary Chinese president. He sees himself in the same league of Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, who were the founders of modern China as we know them today. And obviously, he wants to add to his legacy. He wants to be a great and glorious legacy. He's in fact set a very ambitious roadmap of Chinese being the #1 global power by 2050. Now, obviously, there are impediments to his legacy. One is, of course, this COVID-19 pandemic, which will always be associated to his name. He is facing a sluggish, contracting domestic economy. He is not able to spur domestic demand for Chinese products. There is a disenchanted and disenfranchised middle class that face the same aspirational problems that the middle class in India and other developing nations do. They have a skewed the population ratio and sex ratio from a failed one-child policy. And they have a aging demographic population, which means that over the next 10, 20 years, they will have to spend more in social care and social welfare, which would put a further strain on the economy. So Xi Jinping realizes that from a geopolitical, geostrategic standpoint, from a demographic and from an economic standpoint, he has to accelerate his timeline. If he has to accelerate his geopolitical and strategic goals, he has maybe only the next 5 to 10 years to do it. So I feel that his plan 2050 is going to be more a plan 2025 or a plan 2030. I think if you are interested in geopolitics, or you're a China watcher, or you're just curiously interested, the next 5 to 10 years are going to be very interesting to watch. There is a great game afoot. It is going to get more exciting. It is going to increase in tempo. It is going to increase in aggression. And we, as the Chinese say, may you live in interesting times. And we, ladies and gentlemen, live in interesting times. And on that note, I would like to conclude. Thank you so much for listening to me. I will now be taking questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tanvir, for that talk. And I'm glad you opened it up for questions because I thought I could get started on that. My question actually pertains to India and China's forced dispositions in the Himalayan region.
Right.
And we do know that India has actually been ramping up both their force deployments, but there's
Right.
also a more nuanced aspect to it as to whether the quality of our troops and the quality of our um, sorry, somebody is saying that there's no sound. I apologize. Is everybody able to hear me?
I can, Al.
Uh, all right. Okay. So, yeah. So my question is actually, can you speak about the military capability, both military and air force capability of India versus that of China? Like, for example, what would be required for China to sort of infiltrate our borders? What would be required for us to fight back, and so on and so forth?
Right. So, thank you, Al. Basically, in the earlier part of my discussion, I had actually touched upon this topic where I've said that from a qualitative standpoint, the number of troops on the Chinese and Indian sides are pretty much the same. They have around 230,000 soldiers. We have maybe 225,000 soldiers. Again, see, the Indian Army does face several deficiencies. There are still deficiencies in terms of ammunition. There are deficiencies in terms of cold weather clothing. There is deficiencies in terms of night fighting, not enough night vision goggles and thermal imaging. We haven't really acquired or what do you say, inducted as many pieces of artillery, especially mobile artillery, as we should have. The last 3 decades have been a stall. And that is slowly being sort of remedied and rectified. But the last few months of COVID-19 has obviously stalled new inductions. And the ordnance factory board now has to, or the various ordnance factory boards have to really now go into overtime to sort of address these shortages and gaps on a war footing basis. So the Indian Army does have several shortages in terms of equipment. However, what do you say? One of the advantages that the Indian Army has in across the line of actual control is that in several places the Indian Army enjoys command of the heights or are situated on dominating positions on ridge lines, on altitudes, and it's typically like understood that there is a 5:1 or 6:1 ratio for attacker to defenders. So the rule of thumb is you would need 5 to 6 attackers for every one defender. So in that sense, while there is a parity in terms of total number of troops on both sides, the Indian Army does have an edge because in several parts of the LAC, what do you say, the Indian Army is situated at better altitudes and better positions. In terms of the Air Force, as I mentioned earlier, as I said, obviously maximum takeoff weight is a huge factor, giving Indian Air Force a superior edge. In terms of the Indian Navy, I think a point that I missed out was that while the Chinese Navy is the largest in the world, it has over 300 hulls. The Indian Navy has only maybe 140 hulls with another 56 on order. You must understand that the Chinese do not have a current blue water capability. Most of their boats are more for sort of patrolling within the narrow South China Sea littorals. They are fast moving boats. They don't really have too many guided missile frigates. They don't have too many sort of ships that can very clearly take on a superior navy. Whereas Indian Navy has sort of invested heavily in sort of what do you say, weapons and systems and indigenous radar technologies. We have the BrahMos regiments, we have the Barak ship-to-ship missiles, and so I believe that despite having fewer number of ships, the Indian Navy has a very clear advantage over the sort of People's Liberation Army Navy. And in a sense, again, I am not a military man. It's very difficult for me to answer this question very authoritatively, but I believe it would be an evenly matched fight.
Thank you, Zanvi. I think there are a few other questions which are coming in on chat. I think the first
Right.
one that came in was Rishikesh. So Rishikesh, can you ask your question, please?
Please.
Rishikesh? All right.
Let me see if you can read this question. 1 minute.
Yes, I have it just a second. So the question he asked was, what about the sheer numerical superiority of the PLA Air Force? Does that partially or completely neutralize the topographical advantage of the IAF?
Understand Rishikesh. That's a good question. Understand Rishikesh that the PLA has pissed off everybody. They have pissed off the Russians. They have pissed off the Vietnamese. They have pissed off the Japanese. They have pissed off the South Koreans. They have pissed off the what do you say, the Malaysians. They have taken what do you say, for the very crudely, they have taken pangas with everybody. So it's not as if they are going to bring the entire People's Liberation Army Air Force aircrafts to bear on us in terms of hostilities. They still have to keep a sort of aircrafts at their bases across different theater commands, targeting Russia, targeting Vietnam, targeting Indonesia, because should hostilities break out between India and China, and should, say, Vietnam try to use this opportunity to alter the status quo, they would need aircraft for that. Should Japan try to alter the status quo with the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, they would need air force for that. So it's not as if they're going to be bringing all of their planes against India. And it is likewise that India is not going to be bringing all its planes against China, right? Because we're obviously going to have adequate number of planes on the ground in the Western theater poised against Pakistan in case they open a second front with us. So it's not going to be a, you have 1,000 planes, we have 500 planes. Because you have 1,000, we have 500, we don't have an edge. It's a lot more complex and complicated than that.
All right. So I hope that answers your question, Rishikesh. The next question that's there in the chat is, in a conflict, what happens if Pakistan opens a second front or theater? Russia is staying away very quietly, unlike the Americans, who are clearly worried about the Chinese hegemony. What is your take on both those questions?
Right. So what happens if Pakistan opens a second front? I believe Pakistan will open a second front. I believe that, see, there are two scenarios in which we will have war with the Chinese. It could be a very limited scenario, like, for example, the clashes at Nathula in Chola in 1967, where we fought a very limited sort of skirmish with the Chinese, and they lost about 300 troops. Or maybe another standoff like we had with Samdrong Chu in 1986. So if it's a localized conflict, then there would not be a sort of second front. But I believe that should we have an all-out war with the Chinese across the entire line of actual control, the way we did have the war in 1962, I believe that Pakistan would open a second front. It has every incentive to open a second front. But it's important to understand that the Indian armed forces have planned for such a contingency. They have planned this contingency for many years now. In fact, the Indian Army has gone into overdrive in terms of, acquisitions of ammunition, in terms of acquisitions of anti-tank missiles, in terms of weaponry and munitions to fight an intense 10-day war on both fronts. So obviously, we are now building the capacity to fight a war on both fronts. And bear in mind that, the Pakistani military is conventionally less superior than the Indian military. And as a consequence of that, we would be able to overwhelm the Pakistani military in a sort of protracted conflict. So yes, I do believe there would be a two-front war, but I believe that, we would have a certain amount of control over it. It would not come down to overwhelm us in any capacity. And also, by the time the international attention and the international condemnation to disengage, we would not be seeing a war fought over several weeks. We would see a war being fought over a period of maybe a sharp, brisk war fought over a period of, say, 7 to 10 days.
Thank you. The next question is from Aditya Shivkumar. Is the superiority of the PLA a man-made myth? Since 1962, they have never had an experience in waging a war, where Indians have fought many wars and won them too. Has the PLA been given too much importance, or rather, has the PLA been given more importance than their actual might?
That's a good question, Aditya. I think the answer to a certain degree is yes, because the PLA have had no actual war fighting experience since they fought the, war with Vietnam. and this I think was in 79 or 69. And then again, there was a brief conflict with Russia, the Sino-Soviet conflict. So they haven't fired a shot in anger in the last 40 years. And they have done what they have done very well is that they have actually created this sort of psychological warfare or the psychological information warfare where they have projected the PLA to be the most competent army in the world. Um, Also, what they have done is they are taking a more proactive role in the humanitarian and peacekeeping missions in the United Nations, because they realize that they need to get their army as much battlefield experience as possible. So they are now actively taking on more and more responsibility in humanitarian and peacekeeping missions for the United Nations. But from what I understand, and again, when I interact with several members of the Chennai Center for China Studies, you have several retired army colonels and those who served in the Navy, and they inform me that the Chinese capability in these peacekeeping missions are actually subpar, and in many times the Indian army has actually had to go in them and train them to actually undertake basic peacekeeping missions. That way, I would say both Pakistan and India, from a quality, from a soldier-to-soldier perspective, are highly trained and highly qualified because they have fought wars. But the Chinese Navy is more, the Chinese army is more tech-centric. And okay, and understand one thing: China is, while India and Pakistan remain very manpower-centric armies, the China wants to establish itself as a tech-centric army. So what it's done is it's actually reduced the number of troops from 2.3 million to 2 million, and are focusing more on technology platforms, drones, helicopter drones, unmanned combat, aerial vehicles, fighter jets, tanks. They try to focus more on technology and information warfare and electronic warfare to be able to help them win their wars instead of the actual man or boot on the ground. So I hope that answers your question.
Awesome. So the next question was, the violence that we saw in Galwan is very uncharacteristic of the Chinese.
Right.
What really happened then? That question is from Mr. S. N. Srikanth. Just before you answer that question, Tanvir, I am very sorry, but for some reason the mics are not getting unmuted. I'm just going to work on that and find out why. Or if somebody is able to unmute, then they can just chime in after this question and ask their question. Tanvir, you can go ahead.
Right, the Galwan Valley clash, again, there are contradicting statements from both the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Indian MEA, and obviously we must trust and believe the MEA. This was a cold, premeditated attack. It was a revenge attack. It was an attack that says, look, we can do whatever we want to you. We can do it with impunity. We can get away with it. We are getting away with it. And this is to say, and you must understand that the PLA or the Chinese armed forces are used to getting their way without actually having to get into a fight. They have been salami slicing in Ladakh very successfully over the last 2 decades. They have been increasing their claims in the South China Sea, and they've had to do it with absolutely no resistance. This is the first time they've actually seen somebody stand up with them and say, hey, not 1 inch further. So obviously, when a bully doesn't get his way, he will resort to violence. He will resort to brutal intimidation. And from what I had discussed earlier, I believe that this was just a giant act of misdirection so that they could build up their capability in the Pangong Tso and then build up their capability in the Depsang and ultimately try and capture the Daulat Beg Oldie. So this is controlled, calibrated violence. This isn't the mindlessness of a local area commander saying, you know what, I'm pissed today, I'm angry, I'm just going to take my anger out on a few Indian soldiers. This was carefully planned, this was carefully calibrated, this was very carefully orchestrated. Now, will it happen again? We can't say. We can only speculate. But let me be very clear, this was an attack that was conceived at the highest levels of the political military command structure in China. And this is not something that happened on the ground level in the heat of the moment. This was premeditated. And as long as India continues to stand up, as long as India continues to push back, we could expect to see more of this. The only question is, will we now disregard the border management agreements and instead of using clubs and cudgels, start to use guns, which would thereby increase the actual fatalities on the ground? That will be interesting to see.
Thank you. If nobody else is going to chime in, I'm going to ask the next question, which is, how good is India's satellite and remote monitoring capability vis-a-vis China's? was asked by Suresh Amirapur.
Oh, India's satellite management capability is fantastic. It is, I would say, on par with Western satellite managing and mapping capabilities. And India has made great strides in that area. Each service, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, have their own independent satellites for monitoring and verification. And these satellites have been launched over the years by ISRO, along with the payload of commercial satellites from other countries. And I believe that India now has the superior sort of quality imaging that makes it capable of actually understanding in real time Chinese positions. I think that the one area where India has made tremendous strides, I would say on par with the Western counterparts, is in its satellite technology. And if you recall, last year we actually tested our first anti-satellite ASAT or anti-satellite weapon, where you fire a missile at an enemy satellite and obliterate it at an orbit. So we now have the capability not only to launch our satellites, but to destroy enemy satellites, which the Chinese also possess. So that's a real game changer in that regard. We have actually evened the score in this regard. And it's very interesting because when China conducted its anti-satellite test, it destroyed a satellite at a much higher altitude, which is why even today you see space debris from that, anti-satellite test. But India, as a global actor, acted very responsibly. It actually destroyed a satellite at a much lower altitude, even though it had the capacity to destroy a satellite at a much higher altitude, because they wanted the debris to actually crash and burn into the atmosphere.
Great. Okay. Next question is Dr. Mohit Gupta asked, what are the short and medium term actions that India has to take or is taking to make our positions better? Again, Tanvir, before you go on, I identified the problem. I seem to have made a mistake with the settings, but now everybody can unmute themselves.
So who are not asking questions to mute your mics because there's some static background noise. Yes. The question is, what is it? So let me put it this way. I understand that people are touchy and sensitive about their politics. But the reality of the situation is that India is currently, neither is it, I don't know if it's walking the walk, because the Indian Army and the Indian Armed Forces are very tight-lipped and mum on what they are doing. Obviously, they're at highest level of alert and we should put our full confidence in them. But from the Indian political establishment, I don't really see us talking the talk. We are not, countering Chinese claims very aggressively. I don't see us actively making a case in the global forums. I don't see us responding as proactively as we should be. And I see us most importantly as being sort of retrospectively, or reacting to what the Chinese do. So if the Chinese put out a claim on Galwan Valley, we say, no, Galwan Valley is ours. When they put out a new claim, we then go out and counter it. So what the political establishment is doing is right now in sort of react mode and not in sort of a proactive attack mode. What can India do in the short term? I think there are many things that India can do. Obviously, that India and China have a huge trade imbalance. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, take this with a bag of salt. There's, I think, a $40 to $50 billion trade deficit in terms of the, amount in trade. We can start by imposing tariffs. We can start by imposing anti-dumping on the Chinese products. And what is interesting is that India has always designated China as a non-market entity, which basically means that most of Chinese companies have deep links to the government. So that constitutes a non-market entity. And we have done this in the World Trade Organization, and we continue to declare them a non-market entity, which means that by virtue of them being a non-market entity, we can levy anti-dumping charges on them or on many of their products. So we should use that more aggressively. We should impose steeper tariffs. We should make it difficult for them to export their products into the country. A limited trade war will benefit us more than it will benefit them, because there's a clear trade deficit. That's number one. Two, I believe if we want to be a little more belligerent, I think we can start making more friends of China's enemies. One of the reasons they're so irked and miffed with us is because we shelter the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan government in exile. I think we should extend that courtesy to the Uyghur government in exile, which is currently in Germany. We should let them come to India. We should let them host their sessions and give them a sort of asylum, and that will really needle the Chinese. Say that, look, we're not afraid of you. Nothing you can do can intimidate us. I think that we should continue to build our military capability to have a definitive, clear edge over Chinese capability to deter them from such misadventure. there is a radical solution that I could propose, which may not be politically acceptable, and that would be if China continues to make new territorial claims, is for us to go and say, hey, look, we no longer recognize your sovereignty over Tibet. Too bad, tough luck. So there are many things that India can do in a diplomatic forum and in terms of, politically. Prime Minister Modi has known to be a maverick in the past. The only question is what kind of prime minister we're going to see. Whether we're going to see the sort of political military maverick. Is he biding his time for something big? Is that why he's not really speaking? Or is he really checkmated? Or does he feel that his personal relationship with Xi Jinping has failed and then he feels personally betrayed and let down the way that Nehru was? And this is only the prime minister knows his own mind, but we will see what India does, if anything, in the next few days and weeks. And I think it all depends on the negotiations on the ground and the speed at which we are able to get a disengagement on the ground in eastern Ladakh.
Right. Next question. If nobody else wants to ask, there is a question on the chat, which is, while you have explained the Indian perspective very nicely, what is going to be the impact on the United States of America, Australia, and more so with Nepal also trying to align with China? What is China's ultimate objective? Accumulating natural resources?
Okay, that's a long question. Okay, so basically the United States, let's be frank, the United States hasn't really decided whether it needs to wear a face mask or not. It has a very, I would say, a leader that is eccentric and has always had a hot, blow cold relationship with Xi Jinping. And the one time he's calling him his great friend. On the other hand, he's starting a trade war with him. So really, we can't expect a more nuanced US response. Now, under Obama actually wanted to do an Asia-Pacific pivot or rebalancing of military forces, which was planned away from the other theaters of operation, which was shelled under Trump. And there's no coherent sort of China policy in the military domain except for renaming the Pacific Theater Command to the Indo-Pacific Theater Command, obviously to sort of cozy up to India a bit. So obviously the US will continue to sell us arms, it will continue to sell us munitions and equipment, and it will do so happily because we pay well. But in terms of a calibrated strategy or in terms of a sort of an alignment, I don't see that happening. Now, Australia has really dug itself into a bit of a hole. It was the first and only country to go after China, calling for an independent investigation, accusing the Chinese of spreading this virus and lying about it. And China has hit them very hard because China is Australia's largest trading partner. So they have banned, Chinese, Australian beef imports. They have banned Australian wine imports, which make up the two largest imports from Australia. And that's hit the Australian economy very hard. In fact, Australia lobbied very hard in the international forum to get an investigation into China, which was finally passed by the World Health Organization. But it was a much more watered down investigation than what Australia eventually proposed. And they called it a diplomatic win. So obviously, and the fact that Modi and Scott Morrison actually have signed this logistics pact is important because now, it's a sign by saying, hey, we are now going to cooperate more closely. What is going to be interesting is if India now start involving Australia in the Malabar exercises. Right now, India has always had Malabar naval exercises with Japan and the United States, with Australia as an observer. Australia has asked many times to actually take part in these exercises, and India has not allowed them to do so, not to offend China. So in this year's Malabar exercises or next year's Malabar exercises, are they going to involve Australia as a fourth sort of partner? And it's also going to be important to see how India aligns itself with the Quad. Right now, as to your question on Nepal, see, obviously, yes, the Nepal's new map, cannibalizing Indian land on the map is because of China. There was in fact a Chinese, ambassador who had served in Pakistan, who's now currently China's ambassador to Nepal, and she prevailed very hard on Oli to actually alter the map. And bear in mind, this all happened after India built a road in the Lepuchek region, which India claims as its own. And when Nepal saw this road being constructed, they said, hey, no, this is our land. So obviously China has needled them. I don't see Nepal as an existential threat. I'm sure we have our ways to get to Nepal. I'm sure we will get to Nepal once we are done with China. I think they are biting off more they can chew. I think that Oli has always been anti-India. Oli has never really understood that the relationship that India has with Nepal is far more fruitful and beneficial than the relationship that it's had with China. And China continues to make more deeper inroads into Nepal. So what China is doing is it's actually paying teachers salaries in Nepali schools if they teach their students Mandarin. And China is actually, the fact that China is a communist regime and Nepal has communist parties, they're actually trying to, leverage that communist Maoist link to increase the amount of links with the Nepalese sort of government and opposition to sort of grow its presence there, typically through its checkbook and its charm offensive. So it'll be interesting to see how we deal with Nepal. I'm not very satisfied with the statements coming out of from the Indian Army chief and Nepal and Rajnath saying that, oh, we are brothers, we have such a brotherly relationship. Obviously, they've killed our farmers. They have, erected some pillars at the border, or they've uprooted some pillars at the border, and they're continuing to needle and provoke us. So it'll be interesting to see what we do to Nepal over the next few weeks and months to sort of alter that status quo.
Right. Thank you for that, Tanvir. I have 3 other questions. Does anybody else have a question? I thought I would leave it open. If not, then I will ask the 3 other questions that are there.
So I'll just interrupt you. I've got a question from Dr. Geeta Arjun. Please just reassure us we don't have to learn Mandarin anytime. So no, we don't, but it would be nice that you do. It is the most commonly spoken language in the world. I would always recommend that you learn Mandarin. It will serve you well from a geopolitical standpoint, because China is a large corporation. So it would be, you don't have to, but it would be nice. Also, Dr. Geeta Arjun has asked, what is your reaction to our PM statement to this aggression? I think it's a very limp, very poor response. I think that he did it under great pressure and great duress. I think that this is a man who is capable of being far more belligerent and far more proactive. This is a man who's capable of doing amazing things, surprising things. And I think that his response has been effete and lackluster. I expected more of him. I am disappointed, but maybe there's a larger game afoot. Let us hope and see. Sorry, Anand, up to you. Back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Does anybody else have any questions, or there are 2 questions on the chat here which I will go ahead and ask?
Yeah, Tanvir, this is Satya here. I think there's a similar question is also on the list, and I'll just preempt it. Right. I'm curious about Russia's Russia's position on this, and are we understanding Russia well in this context?
Right. So Russia, understand, uncle, that Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping are the closest of autocrat buddies. They are best friends. They are arm and glove. They are now working more closely together because they are building a sort of alliance against the West, against America. Russia has its own problems with the US. It has its own problems with NATO and Western Europe. And China has antagonized, America has antagonized both China and Russia. And in doing so, it has actually pushed them very close together. Now, India, China, and Russia have a virtual summit, I think next week. The foreign ministers are attending. On paper, it is to actually commemorate the toppling of Nazi Germany 75 years ago. But I'm sure that Sergei Lavrov will be bringing up this topic with Wang Yi and Jaishankar. He will be talking about the Ladakh standoff, and he will be prevailing on both sides to de-escalate. But that having said, Putin doesn't care. He's not going to come to our rescue. He's not going to come to our aid. But he will sell us weapons. He will sell us bombs. He will sell us guns. He will sell us tanks. He will sell us planes. In fact, the Indian Air Force is now trying to acquire 21 MiG-29s and 12 Sukhois on a priority basis. And the Russian government has said, look, we will sell you these planes as fast as humanly possible. We will deliver them to you as fast as humanly possible. So he's actually happy this conflict is happening because he's making money. Basically, he's at best going to be non-aligned. He's going to make his money. He's going to let both of us fight, and he's going to keep selling us the arms and the guns and the bombs in the process. So he can't really be counted on to stand by us in that regard. It's not going to be like 1971, where Indira Gandhi signed a sort of a mutual, defense pact or a pact of mutual friendship. That's not going to happen.
No, but is India reading that way?
Yes, they're certainly reading it that way.
Yeah, thanks, Tanvir. I have one more, but I'll wait for it on again later.
All right, so 2 questions. I'm going to ask the second first.
Right.
Since Tanvir is an expert on both India and China, I would really like if he educated us on why India finds itself in this situation, especially since communist China and independent China were born within a few months of each other. Mao Zedong waged a war within China in 1949 to basically destroy Chinese society as it existed then and rebuild it as per his communist vision. It is only 6 months later in Jan of 1950 that we declared ourselves a republic and had the benefit of British institutions to build that fledgling republic. Sorry, that we declared ourselves independent India were born a few months within each other. And it was only 6 months later, after Mao Zedong's reorganization of China, that India declared itself a republic and has had the benefit of British institutions to build that fledgling republic.
So you have to understand that when this relationship began, when what do you say, Mao Zedong declared the Chinese or formed the modern People's Republic of China as a communist state in 1949, the modern state as we know it. He genuinely wanted close relationships with India because India had actually at that time championed and pioneered the non-aligned movement. We did not want to get involved with either America or the Soviet Union, and China as a country. And one of the reasons that Mao Zedong was able to come to power was he described the last 100 years of Chinese history as the century of humiliation. Basically, when the Western powers actually carved up or cut up the Chinese melon. And he said, look, as a country now, we have to become an independent power. We have come out of colonial sort of control. We have come out of Japanese control. We resonate with India as a country because they too have come out of colonial bondage. And we now need to work together to sort of build our countries and build our economies and create a great future. And at the time also understand that India was following a socialist model of development on par with the Soviet Union. We had sent our best technical advisors and economists to the Soviet Union to understand their 5-year plans and then sort of try and implement them in India. And China saw us as a valuable partner. And I'm not sure if too many people are aware of this, is that when the Korean War ended in 1953, and there was a matter of prisoner of war exchange between the Americans and the Chinese said, look, we only want India as an independent third party to actually interview the prisoners of war on both sides and account for their repatriation to either side. So that was a sort of trust and bonhomie that India and China sort of enjoyed in the 50s. Now, obviously, that relationship soured because, China at the end of the day wanted to assert itself. They did not want to go through a sort of humiliation. They did not want to have their territory subjugated or controlled, and they were willing to do whatever it takes. And Nehru very clearly misread the situation, and it didn't help that he was advised poorly by Krishna Menon, who was the defense minister at the time, and who I sadly must say was a London School of Economics alumni. Very rarely that us LSE alumni get that wrong, but he did, so bully to him. And actually Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel, who said, look, the Chinese are a threat, they present a problem, they are your largest threat, but he chose to ignore it in the spirit of Panchsheel and sort of, a bonhomie, and that ultimately cost us. So there's a lot of Cold War dynamics. It's a very interesting question, but it's basically worth a talk of an hour on its own. But I hope that I've been able to answer your question.
All right. I have one last question, and then I know there are a couple of others, but this is the last one that's on the chat, and then after that I'm going to open it up. So my last question is from Mr. Velu Muthu. There seem to be two line of actual controls: the Indian line of actual control and the Chinese line of actual control. Are these events in the gray area, or have the Chinese crossed their stated LAC itself?
They have in the Pangong Tso region, as demonstrated in the map. They have, as I said, the Chinese claim line is up to finger 2, and the Indian claim line is up to finger 8, or what we call the line of control is up to finger 8. But we have traditionally, we have patrolled up to finger 8, but we genuinely enjoy a sort of dominant position on finger 4. So yes, they have crossed the sort of line of, they have crossed what we believe to be the line of actual control and trying to move towards their Chinese claim line. And this exists in patches along the line of actual control. Interestingly, as I mentioned in my talk earlier, the Galwan Valley was one of the only regions where the Chinese claim line and the line of actual control actually were the same. So, which is what caught the whole country by surprise when China came on and said, oh, the Galwan Valley is entirely ours altogether. Now, the Chinese claim line is, if you recall, in 1962, the Chinese had actually pushed deep into Indian territory in the eastern sector, that is in Ladakh as well as in Arunachal Pradesh, and then retreated 20 kilometers behind the line of control. So I think what they're trying to do is they're trying to slowly reclaim territory to the line at which they had occupied in 1962. So yes, there is clearly a line of actual control. There is a Chinese claim line. And in Pangong So, they have clearly violated the line of actual control and have moved closer towards their Chinese claim line.
Thanks, Tanvir. That's very nice.
All right. I know for a fact that there are others who want to ask questions. I hope everybody is able to unmute themselves. If you're not able to do that, please just reach out to me on the chat and I'll help. Is there anybody else who wants to ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Tanvir, how soon do you think that India should respond? You know, it's always like we don't know, we cannot speculate. Sometime or other, India will respond. It has to, because it can't keep quiet in the situations. But looking at China, looking at the world order, and looking at the way others will be looking at India, do you think and feel that India should rush into it and respond ASAP or wait for the right moment? Because it is obvious that, as you were saying, that India is building up on troops in the border, and sometime or other there's going to be action. But how soon do you think that this should happen?
I think, Uncle, that one of the mistakes that we made in 1962, and this is important because it's relevant to what we're going through today, is that we believe that if we assert ourselves in the border regions, in the disputed regions, that China won't respond, that they fear us, that we are a hardy people, that they will just drop their rifles and turn tail and run, which is why we rushed into a conflict with them. We rushed into engaging them without actually building up our forces. And then there's a wonderful book that I would recommend you to read by Brigadier John Dalby on the matter, where he actually describes India's failure in 1962. I think we've learned that lesson well. I think it's very important, while the armed forces, the Indian Army, Navy, and Air Forces have been put on high alert. Obviously, the question is, how do you build up? How do you build up to a conflict without actually appearing to build up, so as to be able to maintain a position of negotiation to disengage in these disputed regions? So it's not as if both sides have agreed to build up and both sides have agreed to sort of, flex their muscles on the side of the borders. We're actually talking with them to disengage. And we cannot, on the one hand, disengage, but very actively build up across the line of actual control. So we have to move very slowly. We have to move very carefully. We have to be confident of our positions and our, our claim lines and how we're able to hold them. It is my opinion that war will come to us. It is my opinion that war will come to us in the next few years, because right now the Chinese still enjoy a slight edge. But in the next 4 to 5 years, we would have sort of built that edge or bridged it. That is why they're reacting so violently, because they understand that their edge is being eroded and eroded very rapidly. In fact, right now, as we speak, around 10,000 workers from Jharkhand and Bihar are actually working on constructing the other 70 border roads across the line of actual control. Yeah. The BRO, and we are ready, and we will have these roads completed by 2022. So I feel that conflict will come to us eventually. It will come to us inevitably. I feel that we should be firing the first shot. I still hope that we can disengage. I still hope that we can find a peaceful solution. But my belief is that if we don't sort of assert ourselves soon, we will be caught in a war that is not of our choosing and not at our time of convenience. I know that it's not a very specific answer, but this is from my sort of analysis and strong belief. I believe that we should fight. We must fight. We have the capability to fight, but we should take our time. We should wait another 4 to 6 months. And if negotiations break down, and if there is an impasse, and if we have the forces in place, we should look at a localized conflict to dislodge the Chinese the way we did in Natula and Chola in 1957.
Thank you, Tanvir. I have one more question before somebody else jumps in.
Sure, Uncle.
Now, I think the Indian Army
Right,
and the government
right.
is cognizant of the fact that China is looking at Daulat Beg Oldi,
Yes,
because it is the single most strategic point on the map
right,
for India.
right.
Now, having said that, I think beyond finger two, it's
Right.
going to get difficult for India to move in and establish anything else. But I think India also has on finger four an outpost, which is
Yes,
reasonably large.
yes, yes, yes,
Now, while India claims that up to finger eight is its own territory,
yes.
but has never moved forward other than for patrolling, it's a very odd status that I agree that I claim that up to finger eight is my post, but I will not move beyond finger four. I will only go on for patrolling.
Yes, and that is
Now,
because, yes, Uncle, sorry, yes.
that is pusillanimity. Yeah. What is happening? Why are we just keeping quiet?
Okay, so in areas, Uncle, where the line of actual control and the Chinese claim line differ, as in the case of the Pangong, so we call it the gray zone. And what would happen in the 90s and the early thousands is we would then patrol the area, we would deliberately leave cigarette butts, and we would write on the rocks Indian territory. And then the Chinese would come, they would smoke, leave their cigarette butts and their food packets, and they would scratch out our writing and say, this is Chinese territory. Why we did this was because we understood that there was a gray zone. We understood that there were parts of the LAC where we fundamentally disagreed. And in the interest of bonhomie and peace, and I'll get to a very interesting part of this answer in a minute, that we would sort of, not establish any permanent structures. We would not establish any sort of temporary structures. We would not blast. We would not carry any we would not fire at each other, simply because we understood that these differences could evolve into something more sinister and something more violent, which it has evolved in the Galwan Valley. You would expect it to evolve in the Pangong Soap because this Chinese claim land and the LAC do not meet, but it very surprisingly evolved in the Galwan, where the LAC and the CCL meet. Now let's talk about when we signed this agreement. See, in 2013, you had the UPA government. And again, I don't know where your politics lie or where everybody's politics lie, but A.K. Anthony is probably, or rather was probably, one of the most ineffectual defense ministers this country has ever had since Krishna Menon, right? He cared more about blacklisting firms than actually building up the army capabilities. And what had happened was the Chinese actually arm twisted Manmohan Singh into signing the 2013 border agreement. It basically said, look, in areas that are disputed, we will patrol, but we will not build. And both sides have very scrupulously and very strictly adhered to this agreement over the last 7 years, except until now. Now, my submission, Uncle, is not to focus on the Pangong Tso. The Pangong Tso is misdirection. I mean, it is important. We shouldn't be giving up this sort of strategic, value between finger 4 and finger 8. Obviously, they have backstabbed us. They have violated this border agreement of 2013. But our focus should be on understanding the wider picture or the broader game. Now, my speculation is we will get a disengagement from Pangong Tso. It will take weeks, it will take months, but we will have a disengagement. But what's going to happen is that the Chinese are going to continue to occupy the ridge lines along the Daulat Beg Oldi Shok Dabruk Leh Road. And it's going to sort of be a menacing presence, and they are going to constantly say, hey, if we want at any given time, we can destroy this road, we can make it unusable, we can make it inoperable. Obviously, they have done all of this with a goal in mind. They are not going to go back status quo anti-April without their own concessions. And my belief is that they are going to make this road, this DPO road, strategically untenable. It's going to be interesting as to how India actually counters that move and ensures the viability of this road.
Thank you very much. I think my questions are over. Now I'm waiting for others to ask.
All right, Tanvir, I've got a question from Aditya Shivkumar. Another question from Aditya Shivkumar. Can you educate us about Tibet's five-finger strategy? Is this going to become inevitable?
The Tibet Five Finger Strategy says that that China has border disputes with India in eastern Ladakh. It has border disputes with India with India in Himachal Pradesh in the Lahul Spiti Kinnar border regions. It has border disputes with India in what do you say, Sikkim. It has border disputes with India in Arunachal Pradesh because it claims most of Arunachal Pradesh as southern Tibet, including the Tawang region. So these make up the five fingers and saying, hey, this is just one finger pressurizing you in eastern Ladakh. We can also apply the four other fingers and pressurize you in Himachal Pradesh. We can pressurize you in Uttarakhand. We can Himachal Pradesh. We can pressurize you in Sikkim. We can pressurize you at Nathula. We can pressurize you because there were clashes in Nathula, right? And Nathula has traditionally been a very peaceful trade point. I mean, I've gone to Nathula and posed for pictures with the Chinese military in the background. So we can challenge you at Nathula, we can challenge you all over Arunachal Pradesh. And if we want, we can turn the screws on you and we can turn on the heat on you across the line of actual control. It's basically saber rattling. It is basically trash talking, to put a very millennial term, to trash talking. And it is the saber rattling I wish that India could do. I wish that India could saber rattle and trash talk like this because it costs nothing to trash talk. It costs nothing to saber rattle. You can do it very easily. It'll earn you tremendous brownie points with your domestic audience, and it'll be fun to listen. So in that sense, I really wish that we were doing more of it instead of reacting to what the Chinese are saying.
Yeah, I have a question if you have the time. Hello.
Please go ahead, Shri Kumar.
Yeah, in fact, it's an observation and a question flowing from that. Observation, because you mentioned Krishna Menon twice. And you must be aware that Jairam Ramesh recently wrote a biography. And much earlier, many people have written. First I read was T.J.S. George way back in the 1960s. Now, the two, three things Jairam Ramesh brings out. First, the narrative goes against Krishna Menon because he never wrote anything about the India-China war.
Right.
All that was written by the military personnel.
Right.
Who were actually against him. I mean, there's a long history behind it, which I will not go to. See, when these people are studying in Sandhurst in UK, Krishna Menon was a big shot already there. So there would have been ego clashes. So two things which says is that first, Krishna Menon was never given the money that he wanted to build a lot of things. And because Morarji Desai was the finance minister and Acharya J.B. Kripalani used to say in parliament that we are all Gandhians and we are against war, we don't want to spend money on defense. But within the money which was given to him, he was an institution builder. He built the Hindustan Aeronautics. I mean, he set up HBF Avadi, Sainik schools, NDA, DRDO, BRO, and so on, INS Vikrant purchase, and nationalizing the Mesgon docks, Garden Reach, and so on. So much so, people would say that he is the original Make in India man, not Mr. Modi.
Right.
Now, having said that, instantly you might also recall that Krishna Menon was the original Kissinger in the sense, he was the diplomatic person to go to solve problems the world over. So partly because of that, he had a very close relationship with Chou Enlai. But when Chou Enlai came visiting in the year 1958 or 59, Krishna Menon was never involved in the talks with Chou Enlai. Soren Singh was put in charge, who was a relatively, greenhorn. And people now say, and Jairam Ramesh keeps saying this, that if Krishna Menon had his way, there would have been no Indo-China war, because Krishna Menon said we should go for a negotiated settlement with China, which was what, because as you know, there are mistakes and boundaries over centuries. So this was something which was opposed even by Vajpayee, but when Vajpayee became Prime Minister in the year 2003 or so, negotiated settlement was started. So my question flows from this: what is the status of the negotiated settlement, which has been going on last almost 2 decades?
Right. Okay. I'll answer that. We'll touch briefly on geopolitics, and we will then, at the time, and then focus on the negotiated settlement. I agree with you that Nehru feared the military. He thought that they were capable of pulling a coup the way that they had done so in Pakistan, and he had a natural distrust of the military. And at the time, the chief of army staff, who was General Timaya, threatened to resign, and it was only, what do you say, Nehru's convincing that sort of kept him on as the chief of army staff. So obviously there was a huge disconnect between the military and the political apparatus, and it was very clear that Krishna Menon was a victim of that. And if you read Neville Maxwell, and I have read Neville Maxwell, and obviously Neville Maxwell's book is very slanted against India, but he produces a lot of telegrams where Chow Enlai was looking for a border settlement with India. He was appealing to Nehru to sort of, begin the process of demarcation of the border as early as 1959, so that there would be peace and tranquility. And according to Maxwell, he makes it believe that, look, it was Nehru and the political establishment in India that were adamant and were refusing to sort of, accept any sort of demarcation and border settlement. And Neville Maxwell sort of tends to paint India as the aggressor in the 1962 war as opposed to the Chinese. And obviously Bert Linter feels, otherwise, and a lot of the writing from the Indian military establishment at the time feels otherwise. Now, coming back to the demarcation, China is not going to demarcate with us. They don't want to do it anymore. They are not going to do it because they are happy with an undemarcated border. They are happy with a border where there are differences in perception, because at any time they can exploit these differences in perception to further their political and military ambitions. Right? If at any time they feel that India is stepping out of line, it is getting too closely aligned with the US, it's getting too closely aligned with the West, it's getting too closely aligned with any sort of anti-China grouping, all it needs to do is stir trouble in the line of actual control, knowing well that it will not go well with the domestic Indian audience and hyper-national, sort of Indian hyper-nationalism. And then they can use the opportunity to withdraw, while getting India to concede diplomatically, to walk away from any sort of political forums or political grouping. So they are not interested in sort of, coming to any sort of demarcation or consensus. It's not going to happen anytime soon, not without China coming from a place of extreme weakness. And right now they are coming from a place of extreme strength. So if you're holding your breath about it, I would say don't.
I just would like to make a mention, since you mentioned General Timaya.
Yeah.
I mean, the kind of games Krishna Menon was against. The British High Commissioner in Delhi at that time was one Malcolm MacDonald. Right. And his papers have been made public. I mean, it's available in the archives in UK. And if you go by that,
right,
he has recorded, like all High Commissioners, right back to their parent countries, know what is happening, what is the gist of discussions. General Timaya used to keep calling on UK High Commission and sit there and talk against the defense minister. Can you imagine today's chief of defense staff or the army head going to High Commission or embassy and talk against the Indian defense minister? So this is what Krishna Menon was up against. And, and one reason, there's a hint, Krishna Menon, Jairam Ramesh does not mention this in the book, but in some other interviews, he keeps saying, one reason why the army personnel used to go to the High Commission was because that is where the best of liquor was available in Delhi.
Sir, I think that answer is still true. I mean, I don't know if you've been into a TASMAC in a while, but I think the embassy parties is where I've had the best booze. So that has not changed in the last, I would say, 60 years. That sadly has been the case. But yes, I agree with you. I understand that, look, that Krishna Menon has not been able to say his side of the story, and that he has been, and any failure, any debacle requires a villain, right? And if Nehru came across as betrayed or sort of adrift or incompetent or incapable, then the real active villain of any political establishment or any narrative requires a scapegoat. It's entirely possible that Krishna Menon was made that scapegoat. And we're still...
if I may add a side story, in fact, there are a lot of undercurrents to it. You have to read the other books also. For example, the heavy vehicles factory where Vijayendra tanks and also some other machinery, I forget the name. The Birlas were interested in manufacturing them, and it was Krishna Menon who opposed it. And he saw to it that Birlas did not get their way. And according to the biography of autobiography of another civil servant, the Birlas had around 60 MPs practically in his pay, and they were the ones who were taking up this Jeep scandal of the early 50s when he was High Commissioner in UK.
Right.
They used to keep repeating that story when it was a dead and gone subject. They used to keep,
Right.
and finally Krishna Menon had to go because at some stage Nehru said in Parliament or in this negotiation that if Krishna Menon has to go, I will also go, something like that. And then Acharya Kripalani, who happens to be, I think, one of the 60 MPs, said in which case you will have to go. He was driven to the wall. I mean, Nehru, and so finally Menon had to leave.
Right. Again, very fascinating discussion, and I'm sure we'll be able to have this offline or another Zoom call. But yes, it's again, we're still looking at documentation. We're still trying to understand what's happened, and I think it's very lamentable that we haven't unclassified the Henderson Brooks Bhagat report, which was the very careful study of what went wrong during the India-China war. I know Neville Maxwell has published it on his website, about 80% of it. But I think as a country, for us to be able to understand our failures and learn from it, I'm all for declassifying the Henderson Brooks Bhagat report. And let's hope that one day the common sense prevails and they're able to do so and we can sort of learn from it.
Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, Tanvir, this is Satya here.
Yes, Uncle.
I understand we have run quite a bit, and I hope you have a time for another question. This is taking us a little back in history, and again from the current context.
Right.
India's acceptance of China's claim over Tibet.
Right.
Is it historical that if Tibet was always Chinese, or I think quite a bit in this, Tibet was a significant independent region. How did we just straight away accept, or the rest of the world accept China's claim?
I'll answer this very quickly, Uncle. At the time that China entered Tibet, we have to go back to the time of the Mongols. We have to go back to the time of Kublai Khan, because Kublai Khan, who was Genghis Khan's grandson, actually occupied, his greatest and only legacy was conquering China. And then from China, he moved into Tibet. He tried to conquer Tibet. He tried to take Tibet. He got kicked out of Tibet a couple of times because the Tibetan kingdoms actually mounted a very stiff resistance. And then ultimately, he sort of subjugated Tibet to a certain extent. So China's claims over Tibet actually trace back to the Mongol occupation of China that took place in the 13th or 12th or 14th century under Kublai Khan. So that is the historical claim. In fact, it's very interesting because now when they're claiming the Galwan Valley, they're saying that this valley was occupied by the explorers of the Qing dynasty. So they're ready to go back 700, 800 years to justify their claims. And they've gone back to the time of the Mongols, who, and it's interesting because Kublai Khan actually wanted to massacre and kill every Chinese citizen that it conquered. But they didn't. So they have no shame in using any kind of sort of historical data or historical occurrence to justify their claims. And the fact that India readily acquiesced to it is possibly one of our greatest geopolitical blunders of our time. And I think that, as a leverage, we should be able to de-recognize sovereignty. In fact, it was supposed to be a tacit quid pro quo that we would recognize Tibet and then China would recognize Sikkim. So that was the sort of tacit quid pro quo. And one of the reasons why India is shying away from de-recognizing Tibet is then China will then de-recognize Sikkim.
Yeah, thanks, Tanvir.
Awesome. So thank you so much, Tanvir. I just want to find out whether anybody else has any questions. Final questions for the day.
Yeah. Just to let Tanvir know, he did a hell of a job, and I think it was a very enlightening talk. This is his old friend Rafiq Seth. I hope he's doing well, and I want to know where he's living now, in Chennai or Mauritius?
Mauritius, Uncle.
Good. Say hi to your parents. Nice talking to you. It was very enjoyable, Tanvir. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Uncle.
Awesome. Anybody else?
And thank you, Al. You did a great job too, moderating the event. You've done better than your dad, actually. I'm sure you want to. I'm sure
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so
again.
much. Thank you. All right. I guess that brings today evening's talk to a close. I am sure that everyone enjoyed themselves, and if you have any further questions, I will be glad to share Tanvir's number and email ID offline so that we can have him give us more gyan. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and I hope to see all of you soon.
Thank
Yes,
you
Anand.
guys. Very nice talk, Tanvir. Thanks, Anand.